Sergeant Major shoved her in the mess hall, knocked her tray to the floor, called her sweetheart. 200 Marines laughed. Not one of them knew they were laughing at a captain. Not one of them knew that the small woman picking up her broken tray had spent 4 years hunting the exact man who'd just walked through her. She'd buried her face under a gray polo and a civilian badge for 3 months. Mapped every camera blind spot. Photographed a phone that wasn't supposed to exist. Counted down the hours until the trap closed. 60 hours. That was the clock. 60 hours before a traitor sold 14 American lives to people who paid in cash and blood. Buried under all of it, a secret 31 years old, a father she never met, killed by coordinates someone typed wrong on purpose, a name no one was ever supposed to say again, now sitting one rank below a man running for governor. 2 men would come for her in a dark parking lot. 11 seconds later, both would be on the ground, because they made the same mistake everyone made. They looked at her and saw someone small. They had no idea she outranked every single person in the room, and the truth she carried. It was already loaded. Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, Tuesday, 11:47 in the morning, the kind of morning where the Carolina sun hits the concrete like it has something to prove. Hot, flat, the smell of diesel and cut grass folding into something that sticks to the back of your throat and stays there, and in the middle of it, a mess hall packed with 200 Marines who had no idea what was about to walk through the door. She came in from the east entrance small. That was the first thing you noticed. 5'3", maybe. Dark hair pulled back tight against her skull. A gray administrative polo one size too big, the kind they hand you when nobody bothers to ask what size you are. A government badge clipped to her collar. GS7, Department of Defense, civilian staff. She carried a cafeteria tray, and she moved through the line the way water moves through a pipe. No friction, no notice, scooped eggs, took a coffee, said nothing to nobody. Found a spot near the far wall, back to the corner, face to the room, sat down like she'd been sitting in that exact chair her entire life. Nobody looked at her twice, which was exactly the point. Her name was Nora Vasic, 27 years old, Captain, United States Marine Corps, though you wouldn't know it from the badge on her collar, or the polo shirt, or the way she held her coffee cup with both hands, like a woman who was just tired, just getting through a Tuesday, just one more body in a building full of bodies. That was the cover, and the cover was very, very good. She'd been at Camp Lejeune for 3 months. 3 months of gray polos and saying yes sir to men who didn't know her name. 3 months of fluorescent light and laminate desks, and the low hum of a building that never quite went silent. 3 months of careful, deliberate surgical invisibility. 3 months of walking the same corridors over and over and over, until the floor plan was not something she remembered, it was something she felt. The way you feel the shape of your own kitchen in the dark. She knew every camera blind spot in the administrative complex. All 11 of them. She knew the patrol rotation, down to the 12-minute gap between the north gate and the motor pool on Wednesday evenings, when the rover swapped shifts, and the new man took 8 minutes longer than the old one to learn his route. She knew which officers took lunch at 11:45, which ones at noon, which ones skipped it entirely on the days the pressure was high, and she'd learned to read the pressure on a man's face before he learned to read it on his own. She knew which table Sergeant Major Decker Reese used every single day. Second row from the window, facing the door, same seat, same posture. The seat of a man who needed to see everyone before everyone saw him. She'd been watching him for 3 months. He had never once looked at her. Good. She was 9 minutes into her eggs when the east doors swung open. She didn't look up. She didn't have to. She could feel it in the room. The way conversations dropped a half-tone lower. The way spines straightened, not all at once, not dramatically, just a small collective adjustment. The way grass leans when a shadow passes over it. The way men do when authority enters a space, even when nobody says a word, even when they'd swear afterward they hadn't noticed a thing. Decker Reese, 49 years old. Built like a piece of heavy equipment somebody had left out in the weather. Broad through the shoulders. Thick through the neck, face that decades of sun and stress had carved into something permanently unconvinced by everything it saw. The face of a man who had been right so many times that he'd stopped checking. 24 years in the Marine Corps, and he'd had a bad morning. She could read it from across the room. The set of his jaw, locked too tight. The eyes that swept the space too fast. Not the relaxed scan of a man taking in his surroundings, but the hunting glance of someone looking for something specific to be wrong with. He'd come from a meeting with the Inspector General's office. She knew that because she'd watched him go in at 9:15, his coffee still steaming. and she'd watched him come out at 11:30, the coffee long gone, looking like a man who'd been breathing bad air for 2 hours and was just now getting back to the surface. And she knew, because 3 months teaches you a man whether you want it to or not, that when Decker Rice was rattled, he stopped watching where he was going. So she stayed in her seat, held her coffee, watched him cross the room, and thought, not yet, because she had already done the math on this man. All of it. The burner phone in his bottom desk drawer, the one she'd photographed 2 nights ago. Contacts saved as nothing but a string of digits. The 4 people who'd tried to report him over the past 3 years. Every one of them quietly reassigned to the far corners of the earth before their words could land anywhere that mattered. And the 14 men in Syria right now. Walking through markets and back streets under cover identities that Decker Rice had been slowly, carefully selling to people who paid very, very well for the privilege of knowing exactly where to find them. She was 3 months into a mission that had to stay invisible until the precise moment it was ready to stop being invisible. So she thought, not yet. And then Decker Rice wasn't watching where he was going. It happened in about a second and a half. He came around the end of the service line, fast stride, eyes down on his phone, and Nora, who had done nothing alarming in her corner for 9 straight minutes, was suddenly in his path. His shoulder hit hers. Hard the tray went, the coffee went, eggs across the floor in a yellow smear. A plastic cup bouncing once, twice, before it rattled to a stop against a chair leg. The sound carried the room noticed, and Rice looked down at the mess on the floor. Then up at her, with the expression of a man who had never once in 49 years of life entertained the possibility that something like this might be his fault. Watch where you're going, sweetheart. Flat. Easy. Bored almost. A few tables over, somebody laughed. The laugh carried too. Nora looked up at him. And here is what her face did. Nothing, not anger, not embarrassment, not the quick blinking, apologetic flush the room was waiting for. The one a small woman in a too big polo was supposed to produce when a man twice her size knocked her lunch across the cafeteria floor and called her sweetheart. Nothing. She just looked at him. 1 second, maybe 2. The kind of look that catalogs, that measures, that takes a man's height and reach and weight in the particular way he carried his right shoulder, and files it away somewhere that would still be accessible 20 years from now. Yes, Sergeant Major. Even cooperative. Absolutely perfectly unremarkable. She bent down and began picking up the pieces of her tray. Rice had already moved on. He didn't look back. He never looked back. That was the kind of man he was. The kind who left the wreckage behind him and trusted that someone smaller would clean it up. But across the room near the coffee station, one man hadn't moved. He stood with his coffee going cold in his hand, early 30s, lean, still in a way that wasn't stillness exactly. More like the stillness of a man who'd learned, somewhere, somehow, the hard way, that the most important thing in any room was usually the thing nobody was saying out loud. He watched Nora gather the broken pieces. He watched her face, and something in the back of his mind filed it away. Under a category that didn't have a name yet, but would. His name was Lieutenant Garrett Osman, and he had been trying to figure out who she really was for 6 weeks. Because a woman who looked at Decker Rice like that, calm, level, not one flicker of fear, was either a very foolish woman, or she knew something that nobody else in that room knew. He was beginning to suspect it was the second one. But before we get to what happened next, before we get to the moment that turned everything in this story upside down, you need to understand who Nora Vasic really was. Not the service record, not the official version, the real one. Father's name was Gerald Vasic, Master Sergeant, Delta Force, a man who, by every account that survived him, had the kind of quiet competence that made other soldiers stop and pay attention without quite knowing why they were paying it. Not loud, not flashy, not the kind of man who filled a room with his voice. The kind of man who solved a problem before the rest of the room had finished agreeing on what the problem was. He was 31 years old when he died, October 3, 1993. Mogadishu, Somalia. You might know it by another name, Black Hawk Down. 18 Americans dead in 18 hours. A city on fire. Helicopters coming down out of the sky into streets too narrow to land in. Rangers and Delta operators fighting block by block through hostile ground with bad coordinates and dwindling ammunition, and the particular kind of chaos that in a single afternoon separates forever the men who freeze from the men who move. Gerald Vasic moved. He led 6 trapped soldiers out of a kill zone, and then, when he could have stayed out, when no one would have blamed him, when staying out was the sane and survivable thing to do, he went back in for 8 more, and then he went back a 3rd time. because there were still men in there who hadn't made it out the third time. He didn't come back. The quick reaction force that was supposed to reach him didn't. They were 40 minutes late, and those 40 minutes, those 40 terrible minutes, were the difference between Gerald Vasic coming home to a wife and an unborn daughter, and Gerald Vasic becoming 3 lines on a casualty report. The coordinates that guided that rescue force to his position were wrong, not slightly wrong. Not a fat finger, margin of error, fog of war wrong. Wrong in a way that sent a rescue team in the opposite direction. Wrong in a way that left Gerald Vasic and 3 other men holding a position with no backup and no relief and no hope, while help drove away from them through the smoke. Somebody sent those coordinates. Somebody typed them in. On purpose. For 31 years, through 3 decades, through funerals and folded flags and quiet anniversaries. Nobody said a single word about it. Nora's mother was 6 months pregnant when the knock came at the door. She opened it to a man in dress blues, a chaplain beside him. A folded flag held out in 2 white-gloved hands like something that might break. Nora was born 4 months later. March of 1994, she never heard her father's voice, never felt him pick her up, never had a single memory of his face that wasn't borrowed secondhand from a photograph. A black and white photograph that a man named Desmond Holt carried to the house in Virginia the year Nora turned 3. Desmond Holt, Praster Chief, SEAL Team 6. The only man who'd been standing next to Gerald Vasic when it all went wrong and lived to walk out of Somalia on his own 2 feet. He came to that house with the photograph and an old canvas duffel bag and a grief that didn't have a name and didn't want one. Sat at the kitchen table, drank his coffee black, and he didn't say much for a long time. Just sat there with his hands wrapped around the mug like he was trying to remember how warmth worked. Then he said one thing, "I'm going to make sure she's okay, whatever that takes." Her mother died when Nora was 4. Heart failure, the doctors called it. But Holt knew, and Nora would understand it herself, years later, that there's a kind of heart failure that has nothing to do with arteries. Kind that comes from grief carried too long, set down nowhere, never once allowed to rest, and Desmond Holt, who had no children of his own, who lived alone in a low gray house outside Virginia Beach with a gun safe in the hallway and a dog named after a battle, and not much else in the world, took a 4-year-old girl into that house and raised her as his own. He was not warm, not in the way that word usually means. He didn't tuck her in with songs, he didn't fill the house with soft things, but he was present. Every single day, consistent as the tide, and he believed deeply, plainly, without 1 ounce of sentiment, that the most important gift you could ever give a person was the truth about what they were capable of. He started teaching her to shoot when she was 18, not because he pushed it on her, because she asked, because she had grown up inside a house made of service and silence, and she needed, to understand in some physical, real, holdable way the man whose blood she carried and whose face she only knew from paper, and she was good. Not just good. She was the kind of shot that makes old instructors go quiet. The kind of quiet that means, I don't know exactly what I'm looking at here, but I know I have not seen it before. Then came 2018. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, an improvised explosive device. Left side of a vehicle she was riding in. A road that had been swept and cleared 40 minutes earlier and turned out not to be cleared at all. The blast fractured her left tibia and tore through the lateral compartment of her knee. Surgeons at Bagram did what they could. 3 operations over 14 months. Pins, screws, long gray afternoons of physical therapy in rooms that smelled of antiseptic and other people's pain. And the leg worked mostly. There was a limp, subtle enough that most people never caught it. Present enough that Nora caught it every single morning, every single step, every single time she put weight on it, and felt the deep old ache rise up to meet her like a debt that would never quite be paid. She never talked about it, not once. She just moved, a little carefully, a little slower on stairs than she used to be. But she moved. A broken thing can still cut. That was Holt, his voice, his exact words. He'd said it to her the very first time she got back on the range after the surgeries, when she was shaking and furious and absolutely certain that her own body had betrayed her for good. She went 5 for 5 on a 600-yard target. Holt stood behind her and said nothing for a long moment, just looked at the spotting scope. Then he said it, "A broken thing can still cut, Nora. Don't you ever forget that. He died in 2020. His heart, in the end, like her mother's, they found it too late." She sat with him for 3 days in a hospital room in Virginia Beach, and in those 3 days that quiet, careful man talked more than he had in the previous 20 years combined, like a man emptying his pockets before a long trip. Stories she'd never heard, Names she'd never been told. The way the air smelled outside Mogadishu in October. The weight of a decision made in a fraction of a second that you then carry for the rest of your life. And on the third day, the last full day, he told her the thing he had carried for 27 years, about a man named Wallace Reese, about the coordinates, and about the name that sat above Wallace Reese in the chain of command that October Clifton Merritt. But we'll get there. She finished her coffee in the mess hall, abused her tray, walked out through the west corridor at a pace that was, in every single measurable way, unremarkable. Her left knee ached from the angle she'd held bending to gather the eggs. She didn't shift her weight. She didn't let it touch her face. The body keeps its own ledger, and Nora had long ago learned to pay it privately. She thought about Decker Reese's shoulder, the way he'd walked through her like she was furniture, the way his eyes had moved when he looked down at the mess. Not guilty, not calculating, just annoyed. The annoyance of a man interrupted. He hadn't connected her name to anything yet. Good. She was almost back to her desk when the phone in her jacket buzzed. Not the regular one, the other one. The one that lived in an inside pocket sewn shut at both ends, except for a slit she could reach with 2 fingers. She didn't reach for it in the hall. She found the supply annex at the end of the corridor, a windowless room of folding chairs and copier toner, and she closed the door behind her and stood in the dark and looked at the screen. 4 words per tool active. 60 hours. She stood there for a moment. 60 hours. She did the math the way Holt had taught her to do all math. Not with panic, not with hope. With the cold, clean, unsentimental assessment of what was real and what was possible and what was the unforgiving distance between the two 60 hours. 2.5 days. Which sounds almost manageable if you say it fast. Until you understand what has to happen inside them. 60 hours to assemble courtroom-grade evidence against a man who had been hiding in plain sight, protected from above. 4 uninterrupted years, 60 hours before the final data package. The full network, the full roster of identities, complete operational calendar, went out the door to people who would use it to bury 14 Americans in a country those Americans had never officially set foot in. She put the phone back in its pocket. She opened the annex door. She walked back out into the fluorescent ordinary world of the administrative wing. 60 hours, back at her desk. Third cubicle from the left, a computer that held nothing classified, not 1 byte, because the classified materials lived elsewhere. In a false panel she had installed herself on her second day, in the dead space beneath the desktop, behind a strip of molding that looked exactly like every other strip of molding in the building. To anyone watching, she was reviewing procurement requests. She was actually laying the communication timeline she'd reconstructed over 3 months alongside the contact records she'd photographed from Riss's office 2 nights before, reading them against each other. Looking for the seam, the burner phone. She'd gone in at 2 in the morning, moved the way Holt had drilled into her 10,000 times, heel to toe on the tile, weight distributed even and slow. No sound. And she meant no sound, not the kind of quiet most people mean, but the actual absence of any noise a human body makes. She'd bypassed the office lock with a device the size of a thumb drive, and she'd photographed everything: the phone, the single saved contact, just a string of digits, a number that, run against federal contractor registrations, resolved to a limited liability company in Virginia. And 3 shell layers up from that company sat a contract entity doing regular, quiet, funded business with people who had absolutely no business anywhere near American military intelligence. 4 years of patience, 3 months of this particular cover. And now 60 hours. The locked jaw, the hunting eyes, the agitation of a man who'd just spent 2 hours in a room being asked questions he had spent years arranging never to be asked. She thought, "You don't know who I am yet." And then she thought, "But you're going to." The afternoon moved the way time moves when you're waiting for a thing you can't name and can't stop, slow. And then, all at once, she ate at her desk. She answered 3 emails about supply chain forms with the dull competence of a woman who genuinely cared about supply chain forms. She said good afternoon to 4 people whose faces she would not remember and whose faces would not remember her. At 3:15, she saw Garrett Osmond for the 2nd time that day, coming out of a hallway that no lieutenant in his position had any administrative reason to be in. She noticed. She filed it. She kept walking. At 5:40, she signed out and drove off base, 12 minutes from the main gate. A rental unit at the dead end of a residential row that backed up against a dark wall of loblolly pines. She ate standing at the kitchen counter the way she always did. Checked her secure line. Nothing new. She opened the case file and spread the photographs across the table in the lamplight. And before she closed her eyes that night, she did the one thing she had done every single night for 4 years. She looked at the photograph. Gerald Vazetic, 31 years old, standing in front of a helicopter somewhere hot, the air behind him gone soft and wavering in the heat, a rifle slung easy across his back, and a smile, that quick, easy, almost involuntary smile, kind that looked like it had arrived without his permission and caught him slightly off guard. Like he wasn't entirely sure what his own face was doing. She had never heard his voice. She had no memory of his face that she had made herself. She had a photograph, a handful of stories, and the cold, settled, bone-deep certainty that he had died because somebody, somewhere had decided that a lie was more convenient than his life. He had been trying to tell the truth. That was all. Just tell the truth. And it had gotten him killed. She turned off the lamp. 53 hours now. 6:10 in the morning after the range épris at this hour. The way she liked it. The way she needed it. She'd driven out in the dark, signed the log with the overnight clerk who'd long since stopped asking civilian staff why they wanted range time before dawn, and now she was 300 yards from the nearest living human being with the Remington in her hands, her father's rifle. Holt had kept it all those years. Cleaned it every 6 months, whether it had been fired or not, because that was the kind of man he was. A man who maintained things, kept faith with objects, honored the dead by tending what they'd left behind. He'd kept it in the safe in his hallway, behind the steel door in the dark, and when he died it came to her, with a note in his cramped, careful hand that said only 4 words, "This belongs with you." She loaded it the way she always loaded it, slowly, with attention, the way you handle a thing that has earned its weight in a way that has nothing to do with steel. She settled into position. Left leg extended along the cool concrete of the firing line. The ache surfaced immediately. Like an old neighbor who never knocks, she didn't shift to relieve it. She let it sit there, familiar. Almost company, 800 yards. The target barely a smudge in the thin gray light before sunrise. She found it through the scope. Wind, 11 knots, moving left to right, steady, small hesitation in the gusts that told her there was a tree line somewhere out there shaping it. Temperature, 58 degrees, humidity higher than ideal, the air thick enough to taste, and she heard Holt's voice. Not a memory exactly, something simpler than memory, the way certain voices take up residence in you and stay, occupying the exact place where instruction stops being instruction and becomes the way your hands already know how to move. Don't fight the wind. Use it, she breathed out. Slow, complete, and in the small, still hollow between one heartbeat and the next, that tiny pocket of stillness her body had learned to find and hold, she fired. The target moved, she reloaded, fired again and again. By the 7th round, the only sounds left in the world were the wind in the pines and the long, even rhythm of her own breathing. And that particular quiet that arrives when a thing is working exactly the way it was built to work. There is a peace in it that has no equal. She had spent most of her life chasing it. She didn't know it then. Standing on that range with her father's rifle, and 52 hours still ticking on the clock, she didn't know that by the end of those hours, the man she had spent 4 years of her life preparing to face would be sitting across a steel desk from her, close enough to touch, or that the thing that would finally crack him open, that would make a hard, proud, 24-year Marine set down his weapon and put his name to the truth, wouldn't be a threat, wouldn't be a weapon, wouldn't be one single piece of the evidence she had bled 4 years to gather. It would be her face, just her face. Looking at him with the same steady, patient, bottomless calm she had built standing on ranges exactly like this one. Waiting for the space between 2 heartbeats, but that's the end of the story. We're still near the beginning. She came off the line at 7, cleaned the rifle, cased it, showered in the empty locker room and pulled on the gray polo and clipped the badge to her collar and became once again the single most forgettable person on Camp Lejeune. And on the drive-in, the memory came, not a real one. She had no real ones of him, just the one Holt had given her in that hospital room in those last 3 days, Virginia Beach. November, the flat gray light that makes the whole world look like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to be over. Holt in the bed, thinner than she had ever seen a living person. The hands that had once shown her how to read wind off a flag and hold her breath until the world went still, those hands had gone to paper, translucent. Light coming through them at the edges, but his eyes were the same, sharp, clear, present. Not one single thing in them had ever once stopped paying attention. The coordinates were wrong on purpose, he said. The room was very quiet. I knew it the moment I saw the report. The way you know when a shot's been pulled. Something in the numbers that just isn't right. Not a mistake. A choice. He looked up at the ceiling tiles. Wallace Reese sent them. He was following orders. And the man who gave the orders, and he said the name. Clifton Merritt. He's still up there, Nora. Been there the whole time. Climbing. She didn't say anything. She just held his hand, and your father knew something about an operation that was running outside its authorization. Off the books. He was going to report it. Straight up the chain, by the book, the way he did everything. And somebody decided that was a problem that needed to go away. A long pause. His chest rising, falling. So they made it go away. They made him go away. And they called it a tragedy of war, and they folded a flag and they handed it to your mother. Then he turned his head and looked at her directly. A broken thing can still cut. He believed that, I believe that. The paper hands tightened faintly around hers. I need you to believe it too. Promise me, she promised. She held his hand until he went to sleep. 2 days later he was gone, and Nora Vasic spent the next 4 years building a file. Thing about that file was that it was almost complete. Almost. She had the phone. She had the contractor chain, layer by layer. She had the pattern of the Renaissance laid out like a constellation. Once you knew to look, you couldn't stop seeing it. 4 people, 4 reports, 4 sudden transfers to 4 cold and distant corners of the map. What she did not have was the one thing that would make all of it stand up in a federal courtroom and stay standing, the live wire. The act in progress. Decker Reese, doing the thing, with a witness in the room and a record running. So that night, Wednesday bleeding into Thursday, she went back 2 in the morning. The base gone quiet and strange. The way bases do at that hour, all that daytime purpose drained out of it, leaving only buildings and shadows and the slow sweep of perimeter lights. She moved through it the way she had moved through it twice before, heel to toe. Wait even. No sound. Through the 30-second gap between the automated gate log and the patrol that passed the administrative wing on its loop, the office lock took 11 seconds. Inside, dark. She used a red lens flashlight, low visibility, almost no impact on night-adapted eyes. She crossed to the desk. Bottom drawer left side, the phone exactly where she'd left it. She checked the call log, 1 outbound call. 11:58 p.m. the night before. After the IG meeting, 1 minute 40 seconds. Man does not call a stranger at midnight to talk for 1 minute and 40 seconds. A man calls a stranger at midnight when something has gone wrong and someone on the other end of an untraceable line needs to know about it right now. She photographed it. Serial number. The number itself, and then she heard it footsteps, not the measured, predictable, slightly bored rhythm of the night patrol. A different cadence entirely. Softer, more careful. The footsteps of a man who did not want to be heard. She killed the light, pressed herself flat into the shadow behind the filing cabinet, and went still, breath slow, pulse steady and controlled, the way you learn to keep it when the only alternative is giving yourself away. Holt used to make her hold a position for an hour without moving, until the stillness wasn't something she did but something she became. The footsteps came closer, closer, stopped, just outside the door. A long pause. She could hear him breathing on the other side of it. She could hear the small creak of a floor that wasn't supposed to creak. Then he moved on, down the hall. Gone. She waited 2 full minutes, counted them, then crossed to the door and opened it a half-inch and put her eye to the gap, a figure just reaching the far end of the corridor. Turning the corner, a man, medium height, and the way he moved, quiet, deliberate, route-aware, that was not a patrol officer doing his rounds. That was a man who had also studied the camera blind spots, who had also mapped the gaps in the rotation, who was watching this office, not from the inside, from the outside. She filed it, closed the door, finished her work. She was back in her apartment by 3:20. She lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and turned the problem over and over like a stone in her hand, because here was what bothered her. The timing, the movement, the way he knew exactly where the cameras couldn't see, which meant he had done the exact same reconnaissance she had done, and the route he'd taken out, curving away toward the northeast parking structure, instead of the barracks or the officers' quarters where a man would actually sleep. Someone was watching Decker Reese, someone who was not her. So either there was a third player in this game that she had not accounted for, or someone had accounted for her. She didn't love either possibility. She didn't sleep much. She found him at 8:15 the next morning. Not by accident. There were very few accidents in Nora Vasic's life by this point. Accidents were a luxury for people who weren't counting hours. She had mapped Garrett Osmond's routine in her first 2 weeks on base, same way she'd mapped everyone's. Coffee from the east vending machine, never the mess hall. The bench outside the motor pool, where he's for exactly 11 minutes every morning before his shift, like a man saying a small private prayer to the start of the day. And the way he held the paper cup, thumb hooked through the little handle, even though the handle was plainly designed for a finger. Small things, but small things were the entire job. The job was nothing but small things accumulated until they became a picture. She sat down on the far end of the bench. He didn't look surprised to see her, which was, in itself, information. Lieutenant Osman, Miss Vasisic. He looked down into his coffee. Or whatever your name actually is. Silence. A warm morning already getting warmer. Diesel engine turning over somewhere deep in the motor pool. The smell of oil and hot metal, and a day that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. You were in the East Corridor last night, she said. 217, he didn't flinch, didn't deny it. He just turned the cup slowly in his hands, watching it like it might tell him something. I've been watching that office for 5 months, he said. I know about the phone. I know about the transfers. I've written 4 reports that went exactly nowhere, and I have spent 6 weeks trying to figure out who in God's name you are. She looked at him. He looked back, and there was something in his face that she recognized, because she had spent a great deal of effort over the years, making sure it never showed on her own. I'm listening, she said. He exhaled. Set the cup on the bench between them like he was setting down something heavier than coffee. My father's name was Leon Osman, Sergeant First Class. He died on October 3rd, 1993, in Mogadishu, alongside a Delta Force sergeant named Gerald Vasic and 2 other men. All 4 of them waiting on a quick reaction forces that arrived 40 minutes too late. The motor pool sounds went on. The world went on. Nora did not move so much as a finger. I've been in the Corps 9 years, Osman said. I got assigned here 14 months ago, and about 6 months in I started noticing things about Decker Reese that did not add up. The communications, the transfers. The way certain reports just evaporated, went into the system and never came out the other side. A pause. So I filed with Confidential. And 11 days later, somebody above the GS-14 tier logged into my confidential file, so you pulled yourself, went dark. Started watching from the outside. Figured if I couldn't trust the channel, I'd build it myself quiet, until I had something nobody could make disappear. You picked the cup back up, and then you showed up. And nothing about you added up either. You looked at my name. First week. You're listed as a GS-7. Hired through the contractor pipeline in February. No prior military. No flags, no record, no history. He glanced at her sideways. Except you always sit with your back to the wall. You move through this base like you drew the blueprints. And yesterday in that mess hall, a 200-pound sergeant major knocked your lunch onto the floor and called you sweetheart, and you looked at him like you were solving for windage, a beat. Nobody looks at Decker Reese like that. Nobody who's ever met him. She held the silence for 3 full seconds. Who else knows you're watching him? Nobody. Not anymore. My handler went quiet 2 months ago, and I don't know if that's protocol or something a lot worse, and I've stopped assuming I'll find out. She looked out across the motor pool. The math running underneath everything, the way it always was now, 50 hours. And shrinking. We have a problem, she said. We have several, I think. The most urgent one is that somebody inside the system is protecting him. Somebody above the GS-14 line. Which means every official channel is poisoned until we know exactly who that somebody is. She turned to face him. The second is that Reese made a call last night that was not social, which means he's accelerating something, and we have 50 hours to stop it before it can't be stopped. He looked at her a long, long moment. Who are you? And she thought about it. Genuinely thought about it. About the cover. About the 3 people in the world who knew her real identity and her real rank and her real reason for being here. About 3 months of perfect, surgical, hard-won invisibility that she would be throwing away with a single sentence. Then she thought about 50 hours, and about a man whose father had died in the same street as hers, for the same lie, on the same afternoon. My name is Nora Vasic, she said. Gerald Vasic was my father, and I am going to need your help to finish what he started. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her, with the expression of a man who has been waiting most of his adult life to hear someone say one specific true thing out loud, and had finally heard it. From the last person he'd expected. The day had its own momentum after that. A current she could feel pulling under everything. She went back to her desk, typed the forms, said good morning to the same 4 faces, performed flawlessly the small dull rituals of a woman nobody had any reason to look at. But underneath it, everything was in motion now, because Osman was a variable, a real one, a man who had been running a parallel surveillance for 5 months without her ever catching it, and that by itself told her something about him. He was good, patient, kind of careful that doesn't come from training, the kind that comes from grief. He had a relationship with NCIS that had gone silent in a way that could mean anything from bureaucratic rot to active sabotage. And he had a personal stake in all of this so precisely shaped like her own that in another life with another woman, it might have read as a trap, almost except she had watched his face when he said his father's name. And you cannot fake that. She had tried, in mirrors, for years. She was crossing the East Corridor at 11:30 when she nearly walked straight into Decker Reese. Not a collision this time. He came around the corner with his phone in his hand, and he stopped when he saw her, just stopped, looked at her, and smiled. Not warmly, not the practiced hollow ease of a senior man being collegial with the civilian help. Something slower than that, more deliberate. The smile of a man turning a thought over. Miss Vassick, he said her name like he was weighing it in his hand. Sergeant Major. Hope yesterday didn't. A small shrug, magnanimous, false. These halls get crowded. Not at all, she said, light, bored. The voice of a woman who had nothing in the world to protect and nowhere in particular to be. He studied her. That was the only word for it. The way a man studies a face that almost fits a category in his memory but not quite. A face that's nagging at him. You've been here, what, 3 months now? About that, how are you finding it? Busy, she said. Lots of forms. He almost laughed. Not quite, Visick, he said again, slower this time, tasting each syllable. That's not a common name. Her pulse did not change, not by a single beat. Her face did not change, not by a single muscle. Because she had been preparing for this, not this exact moment, but this shape of moment, for 4 years. She had rehearsed it in 100 small variations in the dark. She had pressure tested every possible version of her own reaction until the reaction wasn't a reaction anymore. It was just a fact about the world, like the temperature, like the wind. No, she said, pleasantly. It's not. He held her eyes 1 more second. 1 second too long to be casual. Then, enjoy your afternoon, and he walked past. She kept walking, reached the end of the corridor, turned the corner, kept walking and thought, he knows the name. The only question left was how much he knew, whether it was a connection he had already made, fully, completely, the daughter standing right in front of him, or one he was still assembling, piece by piece, in the back of a mind that had spent 31 years arranging never to have to make it. Whether that smile belonged to a man who was certain or a man who was getting close. Either way, the clock had just gotten louder. She was back at her desk at 11:45 when the secure line buzzed. Colonel Everett Shale, the man who had positioned her here, who had built the entire architecture of this mission from the ground up, who had vouched for her communications anchor, established the protocols signed off on the cover. The one man at the top of all of this whom she had been instructed in no uncertain terms to trust without question. Sect only. Quantico contact dixizit ruled Felfinen plect. Stand by, she read it twice. She put the phone in her pocket. She sat very, very still for about 4 seconds. And then she did the arithmetic that feels less like math and more like the floor quietly disappearing from underneath you. 3 people in the world knew her real identity and the full shape of this mission. One was Shale. One had been the Quantico contact, a signals analyst named Marcus Webb, 43 years old. Her communications anchor, her redundancy, her backup if everything else went dark. A man with 2 kids and a wife and a small house in a habit of ending every secure call with, "Stay sharp, Captain," like a benediction now. Apparently dead. By his own hand, the report said. And the third person was someone Shale had brought into the circle 18 months ago. Someone cleared to the same classified tier. Someone whose identity she had accepted on Shale's word alone, at a time when she'd had no earthly reason to question Shale's word about anything. She opened a window on her secondary device. Ran the search she had been carefully, deliberately not running Marcus Webb. Found at his apartment in Quantico, Virginia, Tuesday evening. Tuesday 24 hours after Decker Reese walked out of his IG meeting with a locked jaw and made a 1-minute 40-second phone call on a phone that wasn't supposed to exist. She closed the window, self-inflicted. She thought about the number 40 minutes. How long the rescue force had been held back the day her father died. 40 minutes, manufactured out of nothing but a few wrong digits typed by a man following an order. And she thought about the number 24 hours. How long it had taken, after one phone call, for the only DIA analyst who knew her real name to end up dead on his own kitchen floor. She was not going to call that a coincidence. She had stopped believing in coincidences of that size somewhere around the second operation on her knee, and she was going to stop trusting Everett Shale. Completely, until she understood exactly what he knew and exactly when he had known it. That evening, she went back to the photographs on her kitchen table, and she spread them out differently. Not in time. In relation. Who touched whom? What the movement of information actually looked like when you stopped drawing it as a line and started drawing it as a web. The burner phone tied Reese to the Virginia contractor. The contractor tied, through 3 patient layers of shell registration, to an entity operating in Syria and Iraq, and at least 2 other countries she had not yet fully traced. 4 reassignment all ran through the same administrative tier, the same access level. Someone above GS-14 who could reach into a personnel file and move a human being to Alaska without ever tripping an audit. That was the inside player, not Reese. Reese was the source, the faucet, the leak. The inside player was whoever kept the pipes clear so the leak could run year after year undisturbed. She stared at the web she'd made until the lamp burned a halo into her vision, and she thought about Clifton Merritt. 62 now. Left the Army in 1999 a full colonel. A decade in defense consulting, the kind that's mostly handshakes and access. Then politics, state legislature, then a congressional seat, and now a governorship, with his name surfacing more and more often in exactly the hushed conversations that come right before a man decides he's done settling for being a governor. A man who had built 31 years of unbroken ascent on top of a foundation that included one single night in October of 1993, when he'd given an order to send a few wrong numbers to a few right people, because Gerald Vasic had known about an operation that wasn't supposed to exist, and Gerald Vasic had been the kind of man who believed the truth was worth dying for. She touched the edge of the photograph. The quick, easy smile. 31 years old, forever. 48 hours, Dad. She found Osman at the vending machine at 2 the next afternoon. Walk with me, they walked. To the loading area behind the commissary, deserted at that hour, all flattened cardboard and the cold breath of the refrigeration units, and the particular industrial nowhere smell of a place built for things, not people. Which was exactly the point. She told him about Marcus Webb. His jaw tightened. He turned toward the loading dock, away from her, the way men do when they need a second to put their face back together. You think it's connected. I think the timing is not an accident. Then your cover is compromised. To a degree I can't measure yet, she kept her voice level. Flat as the dock, which means I'm running 2 problems at once now. The first is Reese and the transmission, which is still coming and which we can still stop. The second is finding out who inside the agency knew to go looking for Marcus Webb, because that person is the one who actually scares me. He was quiet a moment. How many people know who you really are? 3, she said. 1 is dead, 1 I no longer trust, and 1 is standing on a loading dock with me. He looked at her. Really looked. You told me yesterday, on the bench. Before you knew about Webb, yes, why? She thought about it, and she gave him the honest answer, because he had earned the honest answer, because your father's name was Leon Osman, and you have been pulling on this same thread, alone in the dark, for 5 months, and nobody sent you. Nobody ordered you. Nobody is paying you. You came because it was true, and you couldn't not come. She held his eyes. I know what that costs. That's enough for me. A longer pause. The refrigeration units hummed. Okay, he said. Just okay. But the word landed like a handshake, like an oath. That night they worked until 5 at her kitchen table. Photographs and his files and a single document that lived only on a piece of hardware that had never once touched a network. And he brought things she did not have. Tinnel communication logs from Reese's administrative channel, pulled through his NCIS access in the weeks before his handler went silent. Records of 6 separate meetings over 8 months between Reese and a logistics coordinator who had no conceivable reason to be meeting, repeatedly privately, with a Marine Sergeant Major. And one thing that stopped her cold mid-sentence, coffee cleaved to her mouth. The coordinator, a man named Carl Puett, civilian, contractor. He held a registered business address in the very same building as a political consulting firm that had run 3 campaigns, including Clifton Merritt's first congressional run. 2006, she set the cup down without drinking, so Merritt was not just the man who'd given the order in '93 and walked away clean. He was still wired in, still maintaining the machinery, still, 31 years later, making sure the right hands stayed in the right places to keep certain old things buried. The inside player was never Shale. It was someone Merritt had positioned, years ago, with foresight and patience, embedded in the administrative tier of the Department of Defense for the express purpose of managing situations precisely like this one when they arose, the reassigned. The dead-ended reports. 4 men and women who had tried to tell the truth and found themselves shipped to Alaska and Guam instead of a courtroom, Merritt hadn't built a cover-up. A cover-up is a single event. A thing you do once and hope holds. Merritt had built a maintenance system, standing, funded, permanent apparatus for keeping the past in the ground, and Decker Reese was simply its most recent moving part. 2 in the morning. Thursday into Friday, she almost didn't hear them until they were too close. She'd been crossing the north lot, the far perimeter, the low-traffic route, the long way around to the administrative wing, when the sound finally registered above the wind in the pines, 2 sets of footsteps. Behind her, not the base patrol. Wrong hour, wrong direction, wrong everything. She kept walking, same pace, did not look back. Looking back tells them you've heard. She ran the math while she walked. Distance to the nearest pool of light, 60 yards. Distance to the secondary entrance she'd already marked weeks ago as her nearest exit, 32. Footsteps behind her. The spacing said 2 men moving with intent now, closing the gap, not running, but coming. She turned left, toward the loading structure's darker ground, but a shorter line to the door. The footsteps adjusted instantly, smoothly. Okay, so they knew the terrain, or they'd been watching her move through it long enough to learn it. She turned her wrist, checked the angle of the nearest structure, the shadow it threw, the place where the light died. And she made a decision. She stopped. She turned around. Both of them stopped too. Medium height, the pair of them. Civilian clothes. Dark, unmarked, deliberately forgettable. That particular stillness that belongs to men who are accustomed to this specific kind of work and have never once had a reason to think it would go badly. They looked at her. A small woman alone in a dark lot. She looked at them. The first one moved, 11 seconds. It is not a long time. Say it out loud, 11 seconds. But 11 seconds is an ocean when one person in the equation has been training for it since she was 18, and the other 2 have been coasting on the assumption that size is the same thing as skill. A weight shift. An elbow into the soft hinge of a jaw. A throw that used the first man's own forward momentum to put him face down on the asphalt before he understood the ground was coming. And then a pivot to the second. The pivot she had been calculating from the instant she first heard them behind her. The second was bigger and smarter. He didn't rush, which gave her the only thing she actually needed. Time, so she moved first. And then there were 2 men on the ground and the lot was quiet again. Just the wind and the lights. And Nora was standing over them with her breathing only slightly elevated and her left knee screaming bloody murder from the angle she'd taken on the pivot. She ignored the knee. The knee could wait. The knee always waited. She crouched, checked them both, out cold, both breathing alive. She turned the first man's wrist over, a tattoo, small, precise, a geometric mark that read as abstract, as nothing. Unless you happen to have spent 40 minutes the previous month cross-referencing private military contractor registrations against their known insignia. She had spent those 40 minutes, the Virginia contractor. Reese had sent them. Or someone had sent them on Reese's behalf. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that they had known exactly where she would be and exactly when, which meant her cover wasn't just compromised, it was burned. Down into foundation. She stood up slowly, one hand drifting to the screaming knee before she caught it and made it stop. Okay, she thought, different kind of problem now. Osman found her at 3:15. She'd sent him one word. He arrived in 4 minutes, which told her again that he hadn't been sleeping either. He took in the 2 men on the ground. Then her. I'm not going to ask, Virginia contractor. Same outfit as the phone. They knew my route and my timing. His jaw went tight again. Active surveillance. Since Webb? Since before Webb, probably. Webb wasn't the cause. Webb was the response. To someone learning I was here, she looked down at the men, which means they've known longer than I thought. And they've been deciding what to do about me longer than I thought. Sat down heavily on the edge of the loading dock. Tired in the way people are tired when it has nothing at all to do with sleep. So what do we do now? And here it was. The exact shape of the thing she had been building toward for 4 years and had not, until this precise moment in a dark lot at 3 in the morning, let herself look it straight on. No cover. No official backup she could trust. 2 unconscious mercenaries at her feet, and 1 man on a loading dock who had come to the very same door she had come to, by an entirely different road for the very same reason. She made the decision. My name is Captain Nora Vasic, United States Marine Corps, currently assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency under a bipartite intelligence directive that Colonel Everett Shale established 14 months ago. Plain, unperformed. Just the truth spoken out loud in the middle of the night. My objective is evidence sufficient to implicate Decker Reese in the ongoing transmission of classified JSOC operational intelligence to a private military contractor with foreign client exposure, and the secondary objective, establishing the full chain of command for the decision made on October 3, 1993. That includes Wallace Riss. That includes the order Wallace Riss followed. She held his gaze in the dark, and that includes the name that sat above Wallace Riss. Quiet, Merritt, Osmond said. Not a question. Never a question with him. Merritt, he stood, straightened his jacket, looked at her like a man who had finally, after years, heard the rest of a sentence he'd only ever known half of. The transmission's scheduled for Friday. 2300, she said. We have 44 hours, and we work it from both ends at once. My father's name was Leon Osmond, he said quietly, and I have been trying to get to Clifton Merritt for 3 years. He held out his hand. I'm in. Whatever that ends up meaning, I'm in. She shook it. They worked the rest of that night, and by the end of it she had 3 pieces she had not had before. 3 pieces that turned a web into a noose. Financial trail connecting Puit's logistics company to an offshore account that had received deposits on 6 specific dates, and every one of those 6 dates fell within 48 hours of a significant JSOC operational communication. 6 payments, 6 betrayals, priced like a man pricing produce, a personnel flag on the Alaska transfer, the junior officer, the first of the 4, with Carl Puit's own access code sitting right there in the metadata, where he'd never imagined anyone would think to look, and a message from 8 weeks ago pulled from Puit's work email, sent to an address that traced straight back to the same Ankara number saved in Riss's burner phone. The subject line, confirmation requested. The body, one word, proceed. She looked at that word for a long time. 1 word. 8 weeks ago, and in the 8 weeks since, Riss had accelerated, gotten sloppy. Sloppy enough that Osmond noticed, sloppy enough that she noticed. Sloppy enough that 2 men in a parking lot at 2 in the morning had become, in someone's calculation, necessary. Proceed. Someone had decided to go all in, to empty the account before the walls closed, and someone further up the chain, someone she still hadn't put a face to with full certainty, though the certainty was arriving, had signed off on it. 5:15 she made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the black wall of pines behind the lot. The sky was doing the thing it does in the last hour, before dawn. Not light, but less dark. That particular bruised gray that isn't really a color so much as a promise. The gray of possibility. She thought about her father. Not the photograph this time. The letters, because Holt had given her the letters. A shoebox, soft-cornered with age, 26 years of letters Gerald Vasek had written home, 1 a week, every week, without a single miss, that had sat in the back of Holt's bedroom closet for a quarter century, because there was no longer anyone left alive to send them to. She had read every one of them in a single night, after Holt died. Sitting on the floor of his low gray house, her back against the couch, the box open between her knees, the dog he'd named after a battle asleep at her feet, and somewhere around the 40th letter, she had understood something about her father that no service record could ever have told her. He had been afraid, not of dying, not of the mission. He wrote about those the way other men wrote about the weather. He had been afraid of being wrong, acting before he was sure, of doing some terrible, irreversible thing in the holy name of the truth and finding out too late that the truth had been something else. He'd written about it, carefully, sideways, the way a man writes when he knows another set of eyes might read his mail before it ever reaches home. But it was there, in the spaces between the careful sentences. The weight of knowing something was wrong. The long, sleepless question of what a man owes to the truth, set against what he owes to the people who have ordered him, plainly and directly, to keep his mouth shut, and in the end he had decided. He had decided that the truth was worth more than the comfort of his own silence. 48 hours before he was going to file that report. The coordinates came back wrong. She stood at the window with her cold coffee and thought about that kind of courage. The kind that does not look like courage from the outside at all. That looks like nothing. That looks like a tired man sitting down at a small desk to write a report. 1 sheet of paper, 1 decision, no witnesses, no medal for it, no one watching. And someone, somewhere up a chain of command, had decided that 1 sheet of paper was worth a man's whole life. A broken thing can still cut. She turned from the window, went back to the table. 40 hours. Friday morning hit like a wall. The kind of morning where the air itself has a tension wound into it, where something has shifted in the night and the whole day seems to know it, even if not one person walking through it could tell you what. She was on base by 7. Same gray polo. Same badge. Same forgettable walk, except this morning she had added 3 things to the woman who wore that polo. The secure device moved up out of the false panel and into her jacket pocket, where she could reach it in a second. A recording device the size of a pen cap clipped flat inside her collar, where it sat warm against her throat, and a 6-digit confirmation code that Shale had given her months ago in the very beginning for exactly this contingency and no other. A string that, once transmitted to the right contact inside DIDA, would trigger a formal federal preservation order over every single piece of evidence they had accumulated. The kind of order that cannot be quietly walked back, the kind that means that even if something happened to her, even if she ended up like Marcus Webb on a kitchen floor, the case would not die with her. The truth would outlive the body. That was the whole point of the code. At 9:47, Osmond sent 2 words on their offline line. "Puet's here." And that changed everything, because Carl Puet was not a regular presence at Camp Lejeune. He was a contractor. He came when he was summoned, he left when his business was done, and every one of his visits, according to Osmond's records, was preceded by a quiet communication from Reese's administrative channel. He was here today because Reese had summoned him here today, which meant Reese was moving the timeline up, which meant the conversation in the corridor, the name, Smile, the second too long, had done exactly what she'd intended it to do and exactly what she'd been afraid it would do, both at once. She had rattled him, pushed him off his rhythm, good and also. The clock had just gotten much, much shorter. She sent 2 messages to Osmond: find Puet, eyes only, do not engage to Shale, Puet on site. Timeline accelerating, transmit the preservation code now. She put the phone away, stood up from her desk, because the problem with stopping a scheduled transmission inside a base communications system was a simple, brutal, physical problem. You could not do it from the outside. You could not do it from a laptop in a rental apartment. You had to go to the source. The scheduling terminal lived in the communications infrastructure room, the server room, on the east side of the administrative complex, behind a keycard door that required a GS-12 clearance, minimum. Her cover clearance was GS-7. Her actual clearance was a level that most GS-12s in that building did not know existed. And she had a keycard. She'd had it for 6 weeks. That was what 3 months of patient, silent, invisible work had been for. Not for nothing, for this. For 1 keycard and 1 door and 1 chance. At 10:15, the base went into partial lockdown, not a full emergency. A security elevation, the kind of base commander calls when the IG's office flags an unresolved concern and somebody decides to be careful. Keycard checkpoints at the interior doors. Patrols doubled. Every movement logged someone had made a call. Maybe Shale. Acting on the code. Maybe the preservation order had already begun to ripple upward through the system, and someone above had felt the tremor. Either way, the base was awake now. Watching and moving through it had just become a great deal harder. She was in the east corridor when the patrol rhythm changed. 2 men moving fast toward the server room. She did not run. Running draws every eye in a building. Running is the sound a problem makes. She walked, quickly, with purpose. The unbothered, slightly late walk of a woman headed somewhere she is fully authorized to be. She reached the door keycard, a small green light inside. Server room was cold, the deliberate, constant, machine-tending cold that exists for one reason only, to keep the equipment from cooking itself. It smelled of electricity and recycled air, and that particular nothing smell of a room built for things and not for people. A room where no one was meant to linger. Rows of server racks marched off into the dim, blue and white indicator lights blinking out of the dark, in no pattern she could read. The low constant whisper of cooling fans, like the room itself was breathing. She crossed to the scheduling terminal, pulled the device from her pocket, seated it into the auxiliary port, entered the access code Shale had given her 6 weeks ago. For this and only this. The system came up. She found the transmission scheduled, 2300. Friday tonight. Destination, an encrypted external address, a string of meaningless characters that meant 14 funerals. Size 847 megabytes, 847 megabytes of operational intelligence. Cover identities, built over years. Safe house locations, human intelligence contacts, real people with real families who had trusted that their names would be protected. Information that takes years and lives to build, and seconds to destroy. He started the deletion protocol, and behind her, the door opened. She knew who it was before she turned. Not from the footsteps, not from the shape of the shadow, because there was only one person on the entire base who would know to come to this exact room, this exact moment. Only one person for whom this room right now was the center of the world, the man who had set the transmission decker risks. He stood in the doorway, no uniform, a plain dark jacket. his right hand resting low at his side where a holster rides. His face in the blue light of the servers looked like the face of a man who had been running hard for 31 years and had finally, tonight, in this cold room, run out of ground. She turned, faced him fully. He looked at the terminal. Then at her. "You're fast," he said. "Almost, not quite. Admiring, the protocol's already running," she said. "You can't stop it from this terminal. It's done." He looked at her for a long moment, and here was the thing she understood. Standing there with her heart steady and her hands empty, she already had everything she had spent 4 years bleeding for. The evidence, the chain, the financial trail, the preservation order Shale had already pushed live. The case was made. The case was safe. She did not have. What was not, and never had been in any server or any file, was the only thing she actually wanted. And it wasn't on a drive. It was standing 6 feet away from her in a dark, cold room, tired eyes and a gun at its side and a decision it had not yet made. For real this time. Not the setting version from the corridor. The actual question. The one underneath all the others. Captain Nora Vasic, United States Marine Corps. Signed to Dia. She held his eyes and did not blink. Gerald Vasic was my father. I never met him. He died 7 months before I was born. Something crossed his face. Fast and complicated, terrible to watch. The thing a face does when it has been braced against one specific blow for so many years that when the blow finally lands, every part of the bracing lets go at the same instant. "He died before you were born," Reese said slowly, almost to himself. October 3rd, 1993. He was 31 years old. He went back into a kill zone twice for men who were not even his assignment. And on the third trip in, the quick reaction force that should have reached him was 40 minutes late. Because the coordinates they were handed were wrong. Silence. The racks blinked. The fans breathed. The room did not care. "My father gave those coordinates," Reese said. Even. Careful. The voice of a man reciting something he has recited 10,000 times in the dark of his own skull. "He followed an order. He believed it was necessary. He believed your father was about to compromise something that was keeping a great many other people alive. I know that. Then you know it wasn't simple." "None of it was simple. Nothing about it was simple," she agreed. "Your father made a decision that killed mine. He made it because a man named Clifton Merritt told him to. And Merritt gave that order because my father was about to file a report about an operation that was being run outside its authorization." Her voice stayed level, not angry. Anger was a luxury and she had spent it years ago. Just true. My father was going to tell the truth, and someone decided that the truth was more dangerous than letting him live. Rise looked at the floor, at nothing, and she watched him, and she understood, the way she had come to understand it slowly over 4 long years, thing about men like Decker Reese. They do not keep their secrets because they are evil. Evil would almost be simpler. They keep their secrets because the secrets were handed to them when they were young, handed down like an heirloom, like a name, like a flag, and the weight of carrying them grew so slowly and over so many years that it became indistinguishable from the weight of being themselves. Somewhere along the line, protecting the secret and protecting the family's name had fused into the same single act. To actually stop, to set it down, would mean dismantling not just one lie, but everything that had ever been built on top of it. The career, the rank, the man in the mirror, the father in the grave. She understood that she did not forgive it. She understood it, and understanding, she had learned, is sometimes a sharper instrument than forgiveness. He's governor, she said. Merritt. 18 years in and out of office, building exactly the kind of life that requires the past to stay in the ground. And you, for 4 years, have been the insurance policy that keeps it there. Reese's eyes came up. The contractor, the transmissions, 4 people you helped Puett bury before the reports could ever surface. She let it land in the cold air between them. That was never just money. That was the arrangement. You keep feeding the pipeline, and he keeps the file sealed. Something moved across his face, and she knew in that instant that she had it, because that was the one piece she had never been able to prove. The actual mechanism of the leash between Reese and Merritt. Whether it was simple greed, or whether Merritt held something heavier. And now she knew Merritt held exactly what he had always held over the entire Reese family. The truth. He can expose your father any time he likes, she said quietly now. The man who sent the wrong coordinates. The man who followed the order that let 4 American soldiers die in a foreign street. That is what Clifton Merritt has been holding over your head for 31 years. And you have been paying the interest on it ever since. With other people's lives, the room was very, very quiet. Reese put one hand on the nearest rack, not to hold himself up, Just a hand that needed suddenly somewhere to be. Your father was a good man, he said. Low, nearly private. Not a performance. She had heard enough of his performances by now to know the difference, and this was not one. I know that doesn't change. It doesn't change what happened, she said. No, no, she watched him, and she thought about the letters. About a man who had been afraid, not of dying but of being wrong, and who had decided at the very last that the truth was worth more than his own peace. A broken thing can still cut. I'm not asking you to fix 1993, she said. It can't be fixed. My father is gone and he's not coming back, and nothing in this room changes that. She took one breath. I'm asking you to stop what's happening right now. Tonight, 14 people in Syria who do not know either of our names, because you can still stop that. What part is it in the ground of yours? Rise looked at her. For a long, long time. The fans breathed. The lights blinked and she saw it arrive in his face. The thing she had been watching and waiting for. Not a decision, exactly. It was deeper than a decision, older, like something that had been made years ago in some sealed-off room of him, and was only now, finally, being allowed up into the light to be acknowledged. The tiredness in his face, 31 years of it, all at once. He signed the statement at 11:47 that morning, in a conference room in the administrative complex. 2 NCIS agents at the table. Colonel Everett Shale on a secure video line, his face gray in the screen, and Garrett Osman standing in the corner with an expression caught somewhere between relief and a thing that does not have a name in any language she knew. But before the signing, there was the call, because she had answered Shale one final time. From the corridor outside the server room, with the deletion complete and wrists silent beside her. You're still active, Shale had said, flat as ever. I told you to stand down. You told me to stand down right after you called me by a name that only 3 people knew. She said, one of them is dead now, one of them is you. I needed to understand the arithmetic before I followed another single instruction from anyone. Silence on the line. I didn't leak your identity, Shale said. I know, a pause. Then you know who did. Carl Pewitt, the connective tissue between Reese and Merritt. Between 1993 and right now, I've known about Pewitt for 18 months, and now at last, flatness in his voice took on weight. The particular weight of a man who has made a series of choices he does not love, in service of a thing he believes in more than he loves his own comfort. I have been building a case that does not fall apart the second a man with 30 years of political infrastructure puts his lawyers on it. If I'd pulled Pewitt a year ago, before the full chain was documented, Merritt's people bury it in 60 days and we are back to nothing. Worse than nothing. We're a failed investigation he points to forever as proof of the witch hunt. The transmission, she said. 14 people. I know what was at stake, his voice cracked. Just once. Just slightly. But she heard it. I have known exactly what was at stake from the day I put you on that base, Captain. And there it was, the whole thing. Out in the open at last you built this around me, she said. A pause. A breath on his end. I built it around the truth, Shale said. You were just the only person on this earth I trusted to carry it all the way to the end. Because you were the only one whose reason would never bend. Never stop. Never take a partial win and call it enough and go home. A beat. Your father had the same problem. It's why he's not here. She stood in that corridor and absorbed it. The using of her. The truth of it. The fact that both of those things were real at the same time, and would stay real. She should have been angrier than she was. Maybe later, so the statement was signed at 11:47, it named Clifton Merritt. Carl Pewitt. It named the mechanism in full. The arrangement, the pressure, pipeline that had run for 4 years in exchange for the continued silence of a file that Merritt had been quietly threatening to make public since 2019. The year Wallace Ress died and his son inherited the full weight of the secret. Documented all 4 reassignments by name. It provided the account numbers, the dates. The Ankara line, it provided everything. And Reese signed it without 1 second of hesitation. Not like a man performing his own redemption for an audience. Not like a man who had arrived in a flash of light at some clean, dramatic transformation. Like a man who had been carrying something unbearably heavy for an unbearably long time, and who had finally, the strange and total relief that belongs only to pure exhaustion, set it down on the ground and let his arms drop. She watched him sign his name, and she thought, this is not justice. Not exactly. Not in the way that word is usually meant in courtrooms and on television. Justice would be her father, alive. Justice would be 31 years she never got. Justice would be the sound of a voice she would never hear, but it was the truth. Put down on paper, a signature and a date and witnesses. And after 31 years of the truth being nowhere at all, It was at last, somewhere, it was real. At 12:15 she stepped outside into the parking lot. The Carolina sun was doing exactly what it always did. Hot, flat, relentless, diesel, and cut grass, the same air she'd walked through 3 months ago as a stranger and 3 days ago as a ghost. Osman came out behind her, stood beside her, said nothing for a moment, which she appreciated more than anything he could have said. Fouette's in custody, he told her finally. Virginia marshals took him at 1400. Hale coordinated it from the DIN so it stayed clean. Merritt's people have already put out a statement, calling all of it politically motivated. A smear, a pause. Financial records are public now. Under the preservation order, sealed and copied and beyond reach. His lawyers can scream all they want. They can't touch the paper. She nodded. Your father would have, Osvstar said. Don't, she said, quietly, not harshly. Just, please. He stopped because she knew what he was reaching for, and she loved him a little for reaching. But she did not want to hear the end of that sentence. Not today, maybe not ever, because the truth was she did not know what her father would have thought. She knew what he had believed. She knew what he had chosen, at the cost of everything. She knew from a shoebox of letters and a dead man's stories the exact shape of the kind of man he had been, but she had never known him. She would never know him, and that was the part that did not get fixed today. The part no statement and no evidence and no federal preservation order on earth could ever reach. She would never hear the sound of his voice. Never hear him laugh too loud in a quiet place, the way the letters said he always did. Never, not once in her whole life, know the simple animal comfort of being known by him. That was gone. That had always, from the very first moment of her, been gone. Today had not changed that. Today had only made certain that the truth about it could never again be put back in the ground. The range. Early morning, that hour when the base is quiet and the air still holds a coolness it will surrender by 9, and the pines behind the perimeter fence stand without moving, as if they too are waiting. She loaded the Remington slowly, the ritual of it, familiar as her own breathing. Familiar as the ache that rose to meet her left leg the moment she settled into position, present as always, steady as always. Hers, 800 yards, the same target, the same patient crosswind. She put her eye to the scope. For a moment she did not think about Decker Riss, who was awaiting trial, or Carl Pruitt, who was talking now to anyone who would listen, the way men like Pruitt always do once the floor is gone, or Clifton Merritt, whose face had begun appearing on the news with a new and careful expression, the expression of a man watching weather come in over a horizon he'd always believed he controlled. She did not think about the federal case, or the 3 solid weeks of debriefs that had eaten every waking hour since the cold blue light of that server room. She thought about a man she had never met, who had gone back into the fire twice because there were still people in it who needed help, who had been afraid of being wrong and had acted anyway, which is the only kind of courage that actually counts, who had written letters home every week without fail in a careful, deliberate hand she now knew better than she knew almost anything in this world, who had smiled in a single black and white photograph, quick and easy and surprised, like the smile had arrived without asking him first. Don't fight the wind. Use it. She breathed out, found the still place between 2 heartbeats, and fired. The target moved. Osman appeared from somewhere behind her. The way he had started doing these last 3 weeks, never intrusive, just there, present, like a man who had decided somewhere along the way that showing up was the most honest thing he knew how to do. He carried 2 paper cups of coffee. He set one down on the concrete beside her rifle case without a word. She lowered the Remington, reached for the coffee, held it in both hands. The sun was beginning to climb now, burning the cool off the morning, catching the very tops of the pines and turning them gold. Shale called this morning, Osman said. I know. I'll call him back. A silence, a comfortable one. The Silver Star Review Board met Tuesday, he said. He looked down into his coffee, then back up at her. They went through the full operational record from Mogadishu, the testimony, the communications, the signed statement from Reese, a breath. They're recommending a posthumous Silver Star for Master Sergeant Gerald Vassick. There'd be a ceremony. They'd want family to... His voice trailed off. She turned back to the range, to the target, 800 yards out, still sitting patient in the crosswind. I'll be there, she said, and fired. That night she sat on the floor of her apartment, her back against the couch, shoebox open on the carpet in front of her. Holt's cramped handwriting on the lid, just her name, nothing else. She took out the top letter. She had read it 100 times. 101 now. Dear whoever you turn out to be, her father had written, in that careful, deliberate hand of a man who knew his mail might be read by other eyes before it ever reached the right ones. I keep trying to figure out what to say to a person I have never met, someone who doesn't even exist yet, and I keep landing on the same thing. Just this: I tried to do it right. That's all I've got. I don't know that I always managed it, but I tried. Every single time I tried. Whatever you turn out to be, wherever you are, whoever you've become, by the time you read this, I hope you know that the trying matters, that it counts for something, even when it doesn't work out. Especially then, I love you already. Which is a strange thing for a man to write to someone he's never laid eyes on. But there it is. She folded the letter slowly along its old, soft creases, put it back in the box, and she sat with the weight of it for a long time in the quiet of a Friday night. I know, Dad, she thought, I know. The mess hall the following Monday was exactly the same as it had always been. 200 Marines. The smell of eggs and institutional coffee. The clink and clatter of trays and the particular roaring din of a large room doing what large rooms do. She walked in. Gray polo, government badge, coffee tray, except she walked differently now, not performing anything, not hiding anything, not making herself smaller to fit through a door, just walking as herself, for the first time in 3 months. And it was only later, sitting in her corner, back to the wall, eyes to the room, the way she always sat, that she realized something had changed. Nobody had looked past her. They had looked at her not because of the badge, not because of anything she had said, because she had said almost nothing to almost no one, but because something in the way she carried herself, something that had always been there the whole time, buried under the cover and the caution and the careful art of being overlooked, had finally stopped pretending to be smaller than it was. A young corporal walked past her table, met her eyes, and did the thing that soldiers do without being told when they recognize someone who has earned the right to the ground she is standing on. He nodded. She nodded back, and drank her coffee, and thought about 14 people in Syria who were having a Monday too, right now, somewhere on the other side of the world, who did not know her name, who would never know her name, which was fine, which had always been fine because it had always been enough to do the work, to carry the weight, to hold the line in the dark where no one was watching, and to let the truth be the thing that got to live, not the silence. Never again the silence. Somewhere in a federal courthouse in Washington, a case file with Clifton Merritt's name on it was being processed by the kind of careful, stubborn, unglamorous people who happen to believe all the way down that late is not the same thing as never. Somewhere in Quantico, the widow and 2 children of Marcus Webb were beginning, finally, to get answers to questions they had been told would never have any. And somewhere in Alaska, a woman named Dana Whitfield, who had filed an honest report 18 months ago and been shipped to the far end of the country for the crime of it, was answering her phone. And on the other end was an NCIS agent who said the words she had stopped letting herself hope for. We're ready to hear your statement now. And at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. In a mess hall on an ordinary Monday morning, a small woman in a gray polo sat in the corner with her coffee slowly going cold in front of her, not hiding, not waiting, just present, finally fully present, a broken thing that could still cut, and did.